Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Chris Eng. I work for a company called Veracode based in Boston. Today we'll be talking about ColdFusion. The purpose of this talk is primarily not to disclose new bugs in the ColdFusion platform, 0 days or anything like that, but to provide a practical guide for anybody doing pen tests or code reviews, application audits of a web application written in ColdFusion. Just quickly about me, my background is in consulting. I did work with AppSec and Symantec as well as the US government. Participate in a lot of security industry projects. And my current position has me building security intelligence into Veracode's service offerings. Veracode does static analysis, static binary analysis of code. Just a few comments that I got from the selection committee here at OWASP that I thought were amusing. I thought I'd just address up front. Actually, I already talked about the first one. This is not Adobe bashing. There are no 0 days here. If you were looking for 0 days, you're probably in the wrong place. Who runs ColdFusion these days? We'll get to that, but I assure you that a lot of people run ColdFusion, way more than you think. And the third comment was, I just found interesting, not OWASP aligned. I'm not sure who left that one, but ColdFusion is a web application development platform, and we're talking about security, so it feels pretty aligned. You guys can tell me if it's not. Our agenda for today will be to go through the background of the platform, just the history of ColdFusion, where it came from, how it's evolved over the years. Talk about the platform architecture and CFML, which is the ColdFusion markup language, and tell you about some of the building blocks that are used to create ColdFusion applications. And then the bulk of the talk will be practical tips that you can use if you're a developer or if you're a code reviewer or a pen tester to look for flaws or vulnerabilities in these types of applications. So the history of the platform, this thing goes back a long way, further back than most web application environments, in fact. It originally was released in 1995 by a company called Alaire, based in Boston. And the idea was that back in 1995, there were really no web developers, if you think about it. There were web designers. There was HTML. You really couldn't do very much with HTML. So the guys at Alaire thought, well, let's make HTML easier to do stuff with, to make transactional, to build logic into web pages, and to be able to connect HTML pages to a database. So what they did was they took something that looks very similar to HTML markup, and they added a bunch of tags that look exactly like HTML tags, except they all start with the letter CF. And they provide basic logic, if-else blocks, for example, database transactions, and other things that you would expect from a typical programming language. So that was 15 years ago, and originally it was on Windows only. It had a built-in web server. Everything was custom. The parser, the implementation, everything was custom written in C++ on Windows. Fast forward about 7 years, and they migrated over to a J2EE platform, which makes ColdFusion applications more portable from one server to another, makes it cross-platform. And people were going to J2EE, so it was a kind of a natural progression for them to go that way. So ColdFusion 6 was the first version that did that. Everything it gets compiled to Java classes essentially at runtime or prior to runtime. And Alaire, actually, it was Macromedia acquired them by this point. They were bundling JRun, which is a J2EE server that they produced. And then since 2002, ColdFusion is now up to version 9. Most of the recent versions focused on adding integration with other technologies, a lot of the Adobe technologies that you can see up there, as well as some of the Microsoft technologies. So it's been focused on the interaction, the interoperability between ColdFusion and those other pieces. Just historically, I won't go through all these, but ColdFusion has had its share of vulnerabilities like most application development platforms. The main thing to take away from this is that there are still vulnerabilities being found in the platform itself. Within the past 12 months, there have been cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, both in the Actually, there were no details available on that because those were from last month, but I did find some CVEs that reference cross-site scripting. And then there, about a year ago, or not quite a year ago, there was a double encoded null character canonicalization vulnerability as well. And there have been many of those types of things in the past. A lot of this was way prior to Adobe. It was in the Alaire and the Macromedia days. But as you can see, it runs the gamut between all the typical vulnerabilities that you see in this type of technology. And this all came from the National Vulnerability Database. Who uses ColdFusion anyway? So we have a number of different sources here to answer this question. The first one is just a simple extension search on Google, which turned up 310 million CFM pages about a month ago when I did the search. So it doesn't come close to something like PHP with 5 billion pages, but comparing to ASP or ASPX, which we know are fairly popular, it's coming in a third of the number of ASPX pages, so fairly prevalent. This comes from the Adobe marketing page about ColdFusion. Who uses ColdFusion? They have this list of hundreds and hundreds of customers, and I picked the ones with the most colorful logos to put on here. But 770,000 developers, 12,000 companies, 125,000 ColdFusion servers. And there's some pretty marquee companies up there that are using ColdFusion in one capacity or another. This comes from a White Hat security statistics report that just came out last month, where they break down the technologies that they encounter through their service into the different web development platforms. So the ones that are kind of outlined in the orange square are the ColdFusion. And I don't know if you can read it or not, but on this far right side, the 24% is in the education vertical, and then the 15% is in healthcare. This is more of a reflection, I think, of White Hat's customer base than the world at large, but it's data, it's interesting data. The trends in terms of the sectors that use ColdFusion is probably pretty accurate. The government sector is missing. I know for a fact that the government sector uses ColdFusion quite a bit. But again, that may be a reflection of their customer base. But interesting data nonetheless. Why are we doing the talk? At Veracode, like I mentioned before, we do automated static analysis of binaries. And we had some customers ask us to develop ColdFusion support. So we had to learn a little bit about how it works and what the typical vulnerabilities look like in ColdFusion so that we could build the support for the product in our service. So that's the reason why we did the research, and it just kind of made sense to present it. Additionally, if you go and search the web for ColdFusion security talks or papers or presentations, you really won't find very much that gets into application level vulnerabilities. The Adobe security guidelines talk more about deployment. They talk a lot about authentication, but there's about one or two pages on injection vulnerabilities, and there's a lot of best practices, but not, here are the things to look for. There was an old OWASP ColdFusion eSAPI project that was started about a year ago by somebody in the ColdFusion developer community. As far as I could tell, it was started in May and it was abandoned in June. And there were about a dozen check-ins to the repository and no official release. So I'm not really sure what happened with that. And then the other presentations I found, EUSec and some other ColdFusion developer conferences, again, mostly talk about the infrastructure footprint, the deployment issues, locking down the admin UI, minimizing the install, but not very much about the application level. So here are the building blocks of a ColdFusion application. And I apologize if some of you already know this, if you're familiar with ColdFusion as a platform, but the rest of this doesn't really make a whole lot of sense unless you describe these things. So in brief, a ColdFusion application is made up of pages and components. And a page will have the CFM extension, which is short for CFML, ColdFusion Markup Language. And those are the main entry points of a ColdFusion application. You can think of them like a PHP page, just index.cfm instead of index.php. Components you can think of like classes. They contain members, functions, variables that get used by the pages. And they usually have a CFC extension, and they're typically not called directly as entry points from the web. And then finally, you have user-defined functions, which can be defined inside components or pages. They can be exposed as additional entry points so that you can go directly to those functions. These are used for things like web services and also like helper functions for ColdFusion pages. So that's vastly simplified, but gives you the basics. Page lifecycle is important if you're doing any sort of auditing of this type of application, because you need to understand when the request is made for a page, what happens. The first thing that happens when somebody requests the page, index.cfm, is that the ColdFusion server will look for a page called Application.cfm, or actually Application.cfc, in the directory of the page that you requested. If it finds that, it will execute it first, and then it will execute the page that you requested. If it doesn't find it, it's going to keep searching upward in the directory structure. So if it's not in the current directory, it'll look in the parent directory for Application.cfc or Application.cfm. And if it finds one of them, execute it, and then execute your page. So it'll continue doing that all the way up through the application route until it finds one, in which case it executes it, or it doesn't find one, in which case it just executes your page that you requested. The typical uses for this mechanism for authentication, to make sure that somebody is logged into the application before doing anything else. Some people do data validation here, session variables that need to persist across pages, centralized error handling. These are all things that people use Application.cfm, Application.cfc for. Application.cfc is a little bit more complicated, and it has a bunch of different hooks that you can put in place to get called at different places in the request lifecycle. So whereas Application.cfm, it just executes from top to bottom, Application.cfc gives you a little bit more flexibility, and you can say, run this code before the request, run this code after the request. Here's a function to run. If an error happens, or if somebody tries to include a template, which is basically a CFM page that doesn't exist. So it's a little bit more granular. When a CFM page is executing, it can pull code from a bunch of different places. And unfortunately, you probably can't read any of that. But the light blue ones just say local CFM pages or user-defined functions from local CFC pages. You can see that it is possible to invoke user-defined functions over the internet. So that's the cloud part there. And then in green, we have bridges to other technology. So there's a bridge to the servlet, the JSP context in J2EE server. There's a bridge to servlet methods. There's a bridge to .NET assembly. So all of this can be accessed directly through a ColdFusion page through a variety of ColdFusion tags and ColdFusion script. And our second bullet here, it starts to get into the theme that there are a lot of different ways to do the same thing in ColdFusion. Basically, different syntactic sugar around what essentially boils down to the same operation. So you have a way to include other files using a CF include tag, and that says just look for that file and then run everything in it and then continue processing. But you can also create your own tag, which is implicit. You don't have to go, say, define anywhere cf_foo. But if you create a tag called cf_foo, then what it's going to implicitly do is a cf include template equals foo.cfm. Except that the behavior of whether or not the called page can influence variables in the calling page is different. And so there's little subtle differences in things that look the same, but if you're a code reviewer, you really need to understand what's happening there, because if the included page does something to the variables, you need to know what's going to happen after that page is finished processing. There are going to be a few other examples of different syntactic mechanisms for doing the same thing, or different options that ColdFusion gives you, which if it was thinking from a security standpoint, it probably wouldn't give you those options. Here's another good one. Variables are dynamically scoped. So they have these things that are called scopes, and they're silos of global variables that are predefined within the ColdFusion runtime. And there's about maybe about 10 or 15 of them that are predefined. I've got a slide on that.